My name is Chloe. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked as a project coordinator in a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. If you met me in passing, you probably wouldn't remember much about me. I dress neatly, speak softly, and rarely interrupt. I'm the person who takes notes in meetings, the one who remembers deadlines, the one who stays a little later to make sure everything runs smoothly. People tend to mistake quiet for simple. They see calm and assume compliance. They see consistency and assume limitation. I've been called sweet, reliable, and my personal favorite, low maintenance. No one has ever called me dangerous. No one has ever called me strategic. And for 3 years, that misunderstanding worked in someone else's favor. This story is about a colleague who shared lunch with me almost every day. We talked about work frustrations, family memories, and future plans. We exchanged recipes. We celebrated promotions, hers more than mine. She remembered my coffee order. I remembered her son's birthday. 3 years of friendship. One hidden agenda. I didn't discover it in a dramatic explosion. There was no screaming match, no public betrayal, just a pattern, a quiet realization, a subtle shift in the air that eventually became impossible to ignore. The colleague who shared lunch with me was reporting my every move, not in the obvious cinematic way. It was more refined than that, strategic. Information is passed upward at convenient moments, casual details reshaped into concerns, private conversations reframed as observations. At first, I doubted myself. Then I reviewed, then I understood. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about exposing someone in a meeting or sending a company-wide email. It's about something far quieter, something slower, something far more permanent. It's about what happens when you stop reacting and start positioning. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through who I was in that office, the role I didn't realize I had been assigned, the moment I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because I was calculating, and how that decision changed the direction of more than one career. There will be no shouting in this story, no dramatic monologues, just choices, documentation, patience, and the quiet kind of dominance that doesn't need applause. Have you ever realized you were being studied by someone who smiled at you every day? In the office, I was the steady one, not the visionary, not the loud strategist, not the person whose ideas filled whiteboards or whose jokes filled rooms. I was the connective tissue, the bridge between departments, the one who followed up, the one who translated executive ambition into timelines and bullet points. People trusted me with logistics, not leadership. When new hires joined, I was assigned to help them get settled. When a project was behind, I was asked to clean it up. When clients were frustrated, I drafted the apology emails, always professional, always composed, always absorbing impact that wasn't mine. No one thought I had ambition beyond my role. I remember once during a quarterly review, my manager said, "Chloe's greatest strength is her support. She makes everyone else look good." Everyone laughed lightly. I smiled. I wrote it down later in my black notebook. Support. It's a beautiful word when it's voluntary. It becomes a cage when it's assumed. The colleague who shared lunch with me, her name was Vanessa, fit perfectly into the culture of visibility. She was articulate, expressive, and comfortable speaking over others without seeming aggressive. She knew how to phrase ideas in ways that made executives nod. She knew when to compliment upward and when to challenge sideways. People described her as dynamic. We became close because I was safe. That's what I understand now. Safe to confide in, safe to vent to, safe to extract from. She would slide into the seat across from me in the break room with her salad and say, "You see everything, Chloe. What do you think is really happening with the Davidson account?" And I would answer honestly, not critically, not maliciously, just observantly. I saw inefficiencies. I saw gaps in communication. I saw risks. She listened carefully, always nodding, always appreciative. "You're so good at reading people," she'd say. "You should be in a strategy." It sounded like admiration. But in that office, admiration didn't translate into advocacy. When promotions were discussed, my name rarely surfaced. I was indispensable where I was, too valuable in coordination to risk moving upward. Stability disguised as stagnation. And I accepted it, at least outwardly, because I had convinced myself that influence didn't require a spotlight, that being underestimated gave me room to think, that my value wasn't dependent on the title. There's a quiet pride in being the person who keeps everything from collapsing, but invisibility has a cost. When you are seen only as reliable, people stop imagining you as powerful. They speak freely around you. They speculate, they confess, they strategize, assuming you are neutral ground. I was neutral ground. At least, that's what they believed. And Vanessa, with her careful questions and thoughtful silences, saw me not as competition, but as a resource. What I didn't realize then was that while I was observing the room, someone else was observing me. You can be underestimated in many ways. Sometimes the most dangerous one is being considered harmless. The first cut wasn't dramatic. It never is. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon during a budget alignment meeting. Nothing unusual. 6 of us are in a glass conference room. Slides projected. Coffee is going cold. Vanessa was presenting. Halfway through the discussion, our director asked a question about timeline compression, whether we could realistically deliver Phase 2 2 weeks earlier without compromising quality. Before anyone else spoke, Vanessa glanced at me, just briefly. Then she said, "Chloe and I were actually talking about this yesterday over lunch. She mentioned she wasn't sure the operations team could handle the acceleration." I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me. I had said something like that, but not in that tone, not as a firm position. It had been a private observation, thoughtful, measured. I'd said, "If we compress without additional resources, there's risk. No, it can't be done." The director leaned forward. "So you don't think it's feasible?" The wording mattered. I paused, choosing carefully. "I think it's possible with adjusted support from operations. Without that, we'd be stretching capacity." A safe answer, balanced. Vanessa nodded as if we were aligned. "Right, exactly. That's what I told you." But she hadn't told him that. She had translated uncertainty into resistance, nuance into hesitation. It was subtle enough that no one would call it misrepresentation, just interpretation. The meeting moved on. The moment passed. But something stayed with me. Afterward, in the hallway, Vanessa looped her arm through mine lightly. "I hope you didn't mind me bringing that up," she said. "I just think leadership should know how thoughtful you are about risk." The words were flattering. The sensation wasn't. I smiled. It's fine. And I meant it. At least partly. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even fully suspicious. I just felt repositioned, slightly tilted out of alignment. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Small, forgettable. She would reference our conversation in meetings. She would summarize my private concerns in a slightly sharpened way. She never lied outright. She just edited the tone. When I suggested process improvements, she would preface them with, "Chloe tends to worry about scalability," before I could speak. Tends to worry. Not analyzes risk, not anticipates friction, just worries. Language is architecture, and she was rearranging mine. The strange part was that no one else seemed to notice. Why would they? On the surface, she was crediting me, mentioning me, including me in strategic conversations. From the outside, it looked collaborative. From the inside, it felt like erosion. But I told myself I was overthinking it. She was ambitious. Of course she reframed ideas. That's what strong communicators do. Maybe I should be more assertive. Maybe this discomfort was just my own hesitation reflecting back at me. So I adjusted. I spoke more clearly. I clarified my positions. And she adjusted too. That was when I began to understand something important. It wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about control of narrative. And I had just felt the first small cut, not deep enough to bleed, but precise enough to remember. The human mind is remarkably efficient at protecting comfort. When something feels slightly wrong, but not wrong enough to justify confrontation, we smooth it over. We rationalize, we contextualize, we explain it in ways that preserve stability. That's what I did. After the first few reframings in meetings, I told myself Vanessa was just ambitious, that she processed information differently, that maybe I was too sensitive to wording. I even adjusted my internal language. Instead of thinking she misrepresented me, I reframed it as, she communicates strategically. That shift mattered. It made her behavior sound intelligent rather than invasive. And because nothing exploded, because no one openly disrespected me, because I was still included in meetings and lunches and team chats, the pattern normalized. Vanessa continued referencing our private conversations publicly, but now it came wrapped in praise. "Chloe always thinks 5 steps ahead. Chloe tends to flag worst-case scenarios. Chloe's very cautious about change." Each sentence sounded complimentary. Each one placed me subtly outside momentum. Cautious. Worried. Risk-aware. In an organization that prized speed and boldness, those adjectives quietly repositioned me as friction, and I let it happen. I didn't challenge her wording. I didn't say, "That's not what I meant." I didn't pull her aside to ask why she kept summarizing me in rooms I wasn't ready to speak in. Why? Because socially, it would have looked ungrateful. She was including me. She was giving me visibility. That's how it would be interpreted. There's a particular kind of disrespect that hides behind politeness. It doesn't insult you directly, it just edits you. I remember one lunch where she asked, "Do you ever feel like leadership moves too fast without understanding downstream impact?" It was framed as shared frustration. I answered thoughtfully. I spoke about structural gaps, about how timelines often ignore operational bandwidth. I wasn't criticizing people, I was analyzing systems. 2 days later, in a planning session, our director said casually, "Vanessa mentioned that Chloe thinks our rollout strategy is reckless." Reckless. That word had never left my mouth. The room went quiet for half a second, the kind of quiet that passes so quickly you can't prove it existed. I felt it. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "I wouldn't say reckless," she said smoothly, "just that she's very concerned about capacity strain." It was subtle, controlled, protective. She softened it after the damage was done. I could have corrected it then. I could have said that's not accurate. I could have clarified that my analysis wasn't an accusation. Instead, I chose diplomacy. "I think with the right support, it's manageable," I said calmly. The meeting moved on. Pattern reinforced. And here's the truth I didn't want to admit at the time. Part of me believed that staying quiet made me superior. Not reacting meant I was emotionally evolved. That restraint equaled strength. But there's a difference between composure and avoidance. The repetition continued. My ideas began reaching rooms before I did. Reshaped, filtered, sometimes sharpened. My tone was slowly being curated by someone else. And because I didn't protest, everyone assumed consent. Disrespect when unchallenged becomes culture. And culture, once normalized, becomes expectation. By the end of the second year of our friendship, I had unknowingly accepted a new identity in the office. Valuable, intelligent, cautious, limiting, not dangerous, not strategic, not ambitious. That narrative wasn't loud, but it was spreading. And I had helped it grow by saying nothing. There's a moment in every long pattern when you stop asking, "Why is this happening?" and start asking, "What role am I playing in it?" For me, that moment came during performance review season. Not mine, hers. Vanessa had been shortlisted for a promotion to strategy lead, a role that would formally position her in rooms where decisions were shaped, not just executed. The announcement wasn't official yet, but everyone knew. The way senior leadership lingered in conversation with her, the way she was invited into pre-meetings before the real meetings. One afternoon, I was asked to prepare a summary document outlining the operational risks across our largest accounts, a document that would support strategic planning discussions. It was detailed work, cross-departmental dependencies, budget sensitivities, personnel constraints, the kind of analysis that required not just data, but context. I completed it in 2 days. The following week, Vanessa presented a strategic framework to leadership that referenced nearly every point from that document. Not copied, integrated, elevated, repackaged in visionary language. "Long-term scalability requires risk-aware pacing," she said confidently in the meeting, gesturing to a slide that mirrored a paragraph I had written in plain text. No one asked who built the foundation. They saw who delivered it. And that was when something clicked. I wasn't being attacked. I was being positioned. There's a difference. Attacks are loud. Positioning is architectural. Over 3 years, a quiet structure had formed around me. I was the dependable analyst, the operational conscience, the steady backbone, the one who kept things grounded. Vanessa was the translator, the amplifier, the strategist who could see the big picture. The truth? I saw the big picture too. I just didn't advertise it. But in environments where perception is currency, silence is surrender. I began replaying moments in my mind. Lunches, meetings, hallway conversations. I noticed how often she asked leading questions, how frequently she invited me to vent, how carefully she listened when I expressed concerns about leadership blind spots. She wasn't stealing ideas in a crude way. She was harvesting perspective and then curating it. My role had been assigned gradually: reliable, insightful, but cautious, deep, but not bold, valuable, but not promotable. And because I never disrupted the narrative, it solidified. Here's the uncomfortable part. She didn't invent this role alone. The office culture was ready for it. Organizations love quiet competence. It stabilizes chaos. It absorbs pressure. It prevents public failure. But they rarely reward it with authority. Authority requires visibility. And visibility, I had outsourced. I realized that day that my invisibility wasn't accidental. It was convenient. For leadership, for Vanessa, for everyone except me. But instead of feeling anger, I felt clarity. I finally understood the shape of the cage. And once you can see the structure, you can start studying its weak points. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation or a dramatic reveal. It happened on an ordinary Thursday at 6:40 p.m., long after most of the office lights had dimmed. I was still at my desk, reviewing a revised proposal timeline. The building had that end-of-day silence, the hum of HVAC, the occasional elevator chime. My black notebook was open beside me, pages filled with neat bullet points from the past 3 years. I wasn't reading them intentionally at first, I was just flipping. But patterns reveal themselves when you stop rushing. I saw timestamps, dates of meetings, notes about phrasing, moments when Vanessa had referenced our lunches, instances where leadership feedback about me echoed her descriptions almost verbatim. Chloe is incredibly thorough, but sometimes hesitant about bold moves. Chloe flags risks early, which we appreciate, but she may not be the right fit for fast-growth initiatives. Hesitant, risk-averse, not right for speed. I had written those comments down at the time as neutral feedback. Now, stacked together across pages, they form something else, a trajectory. And then I noticed something more unsettling. Many of the phrases used in my evaluations were words I had once spoken privately to Vanessa. Reflections about burnout risk, about rushed scaling, about resource strain. No complaints, concerns, careful ones. They had migrated upward, filtered, polished, repositioned. That was the moment something inside me stilled. Not anger, stillness. For 3 years, I had assumed proximity meant trust, that shared lunches meant shared loyalty, that being confided in was mutual. But I wasn't in a friendship. I was in a funnel. Information flowed in one direction, upward, through her. And I had been the reservoir. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. There are moments in life when you can choose indignation, or you can choose recalibration. I thought about confronting her, about asking directly, "Are you repeating my private conversations?" But confrontation would only produce denial or refinement. It wouldn't change the structure. The structure wasn't emotional. It was strategic. So the shift wasn't external. It was internal. I decided in that quiet office that my silence would no longer be passive. It would be selective. I would stop offering raw analysis in informal spaces. I would stop sharing unfiltered concerns over salads and sparkling water. I would stop assuming intimacy where incentives conflicted. Not cold, not hostile, just measured. There's a difference between being open and being accessible. I had been accessible. That night, as I packed my bag, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt educated. The colleague who shared lunch with me was reporting my every move. Not because she hated me, not because she was cartoonishly malicious, but because information was leverage, and I had been giving it away for free. The shift was simple. If perspective were power, I would decide where it flowed. I turned off my desk lamp, and for the first time in 3 years, I walked out of that office, not as support, but as strategy. The next Monday, I still sat across from Vanessa in the break room. Same table, same salads, same polite laughter about a chaotic client call. Externally, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. She asked the first probing question within 5 minutes. "So what do you really think about the leadership reshuffle?" she said lightly, spearing a cherry tomato. Off the record. 3 words I had grown too comfortable with. Off the record. I smiled, the same way I always had. "I think transitions are complicated," I said calmly. "It'll depend on how clearly roles are defined. Neutral, balanced, unusable." She waited a second, as if expecting more. When nothing followed, she nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, "clarity is everything." That week, I noticed how often she left conversational space open. Little pauses designed to invite elaboration. She was good at silence, it made people feel it. But I no longer felt compelled to. When she speculated about our director's confidence level, I responded with questions instead of opinions. "What makes you think that?" When she suggested a rollout strategy might implode, I shrugged gently. "Time will tell." Silence is uncomfortable for people who rely on extraction. By the second week, she adjusted tactics. "You've been quiet lately," she observed one afternoon, half smiling. "Everything okay?" That was the first direct test. There's a tone people use when they suspect distance, a subtle blend of concern and evaluation. I met her eyes evenly. "I've just been focused." It was true. Focus is a socially acceptable boundary. She studied me for half a second too long, then returned to her laptop. In meetings, I shifted too. When asked for input, I spoke concisely and documented follow-ups in writing. I began sending summary emails after discussions, clear, precise language outlining my positions without emotional shading. Documentation changes power dynamics. It creates timestamps. It reduces reinterpretation. And interestingly, within a month, something else shifted. Without my private commentary, Vanessa's strategic insights began sounding thinner, less textured. She still presented confidently, but some of the nuanced risk framing that had once colored her proposals was gone, because it had never originated there. I didn't sabotage her. I simply stopped supplying her. People often mistake silence for weakness, but intentional silence is filtration. I watched carefully. I observed who approached her for information. I noted who referenced her summaries in leadership check-ins. I paid attention to which executives leaned forward when she spoke, and which ones asked follow-up questions she struggled to answer without depth. The difference between us had never been intelligence. It had been delivered. And delivery without substance eventually exposes itself. But I wasn't waiting for her to fail. That wasn't the point. The point was ownership. For the first time in 3 years, my thoughts were not being pre-tested through someone else's mouth. They were staying with me. And something surprising happened in that restraint. My confidence sharpened. Not because I was withholding out of spite, but because I was finally aware of my value. Information isn't just data. It's timing, it's framing, it's leverage. And I had decided that my silence would no longer be the default. It would be deliberate. When people think of preparation, they imagine action. Bold moves, strategic meetings, late-night plans drawn across whiteboards. My preparation looked ordinary. That's why no one noticed. I didn't change departments. I didn't request a title review. I didn't suddenly become louder in meetings. If anything, I appeared even more contained. But behind that containment, I was repositioning. First, I audited my own patterns. I reread 3 years of performance feedback. I highlighted recurring adjectives: thorough, cautious, detail-oriented, supportive. Then I compared them to promotion criteria for strategic roles: visionary, decisive, cross-functional influence, and risk-balanced growth. The gap wasn't skill, it was narrative. So I started adjusting mine. Not verbally, but structurally. Instead of offering operational summaries, I began attaching forward-looking recommendations. Not emotional critiques, not reactive concerns, structured projections. If we accelerate Q3 rollout by 15%, here are 3 compensating resource shifts that preserve margin. Not this could be risky, but here's how to do it safely. There's a difference between flagging danger and designing solutions. The second one gets remembered. I also changed who received my thinking. Instead of processing ideas over lunch, I began scheduling brief one-on-one check-ins with department heads, framed as alignment sessions. I've been mapping cross-team dependencies, I would say calmly. I'd love your perspective. I wasn't pitching myself. I was building visibility through contribution. Every conversation ended with a follow-up summary email, clear bullet points, action options, timeline suggestions. Documentation became rhythm. At the same time, I paid attention to something else: Vanessa's information flow. I noticed that when I stopped offering textured analysis, she started fishing more broadly. She began asking others similar questions she once asked me. What's your honest take? Do you think leadership is overreaching? But most people answered superficially. They vented. They speculated. They didn't dissect systems. And speculation doesn't scale into strategy. I also began quietly strengthening an overlooked asset: relationships outside her orbit. Finance, operations, compliance. People who rarely had a voice in flashy presentations, but whose data determined feasibility. I asked them thoughtful questions. I listened without judgment. I helped refine their concerns into executive-ready language. Not for Vanessa, for them. Then I did something subtle but important. I stopped correcting misperceptions immediately. If someone described me as detail-focused, I would nod, and then follow with a high-level projection. Yes, and long-term. That detail allows us to forecast volatility before it hits margin. Shift. Expansion. No confrontation, just redefinition. Meanwhile, I documented every instance where my previous comments had been reframed in ways that altered tone. Not for revenge, not to present dramatically, just to understand the architecture fully. Patterns are leveraged when understood calmly. By the 3rd month of this quiet recalibration, small changes were visible. A senior partner began asking me directly for rollout timing opinions. Without routing through Vanessa, An operations lead referenced my projection model in a cross-team meeting. And once, in a strategy review, when Vanessa summarized a risk framing without depth, the director turned to me and asked, "Chloe, can you expand on that?" That pause mattered, because this time I wasn't expanding on her version. I was delivering mine. Prepared, structured, controlled. Here's what they never noticed. I wasn't trying to expose her. I was outgrowing the position she had assigned me. When someone builds influence by curating your thinking, the most effective disruption isn't confrontation, it's independence. I didn't need to accuse her of reporting my every move. I just needed to make my moves visible, on my own terms. Quiet dominance isn't about crushing someone. It's about removing your dependency on their leverage. And by the time anyone sensed the shift, the foundation had already moved. The private reveal didn't come from a dramatic confession. It came from a spreadsheet. Late one evening, I was reviewing quarterly performance allocations, not because I was required to, but because I had started paying attention to where credit translated into compensation. Consulting firms don't just reward outcomes, they reward attribution. Who originated the idea? Who carried the relationship? Who was seen as driving momentum? For 3 years, I had focused on execution quality. I assumed that the results spoke for themselves. They don't. Results are narrated. As I traced project histories, something became clear. Several of the strategic pivots Vanessa was credited for, the risk-balanced rollout approach, the phased resource buffering model, the compliance-first sequencing, mirrored frameworks I had initially drafted in internal documents or discussed privately. Not copied line for line, abstracted, elevated, positioned as foresight. And because my contributions had lived in operational summaries rather than strategic decks, the origin story blurred. I wasn't erased. I was backgrounded. There's a difference. Erasure is hostile. Backgrounding is convenient. I leaned back in my chair and felt something settle into place. The colleague who shared lunch with me wasn't just reporting my every move. She was translating my internal analysis into external influence. And leadership, unintentionally or not, was rewarding the translator. That realization could have sparked anger. It didn't. It sparked precision, because in that spreadsheet I saw more than attribution patterns. I saw leverage. The firm was preparing for a structural expansion, opening a satellite office within 18 months. Strategy leadership would need operational intelligence to make that expansion viable. Intelligence I had been building quietly for years. Cross-department risk mapping, capacity forecasting models, vendor reliability data, historical failure analysis. Vanessa had presentation fluency. I had infrastructure insight, and expansion would expose the difference. That was the private reveal. My value wasn't in defending my past contributions. It was in controlling future architecture. I didn't need to confront her about past reframing. I didn't need to gather evidence or stage an exposure. I needed to step into a room where translation wasn't enough. Over the next week, I began assembling something deliberately. A forward-looking expansion viability report, not requested, not announced, just built. It wasn't flashy, no dramatic language, no visionary metaphors. It was structured around risk-adjusted growth. What markets could sustain scaling? What staffing models prevented burnout? Where margin compression would occur if timelines were misaligned? How phased deployment could preserve brand stability? It was strategic, but grounded in data no one else had synthesized fully, and I kept it private. For now. Meanwhile, I observed Vanessa more carefully. Without my informal insights, her strategic framing began leaning heavily on optimism, broader strokes, less operational anchoring. Leadership didn't criticize her, but they began asking harder follow-ups. What would that look like in practice? How would we mitigate resource strain? Have we modeled failure points? Questions that required depth, questions I had been answering quietly for years. The private reveal wasn't that she was malicious. It was that our incentives had never aligned. Friendship, in environments built on advancement, is often proximity, not loyalty. And proximity without shared risk is asymmetrical. I understood something else too. If I wanted authority, I would have to enter the conversation directly, not as support, not as background, as origin. So I scheduled a meeting, not with her, with the senior partner overseeing the expansion strategy. Subject line, preliminary operational viability modeling for market expansion. Calm, neutral, unthreatening. I didn't feel triumphant when I hit send. I felt aligned. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to narrative. I was initiating one. And once you initiate at the right level, translation becomes unnecessary. There are moments when you realize you have more than one option. You can stay contained. You can confront directly. Or you can step into a position that changes the structure entirely. The meeting with the senior partner was scheduled for 8 a.m. on a Wednesday, before the usual rhythm of the office began. That detail alone told me something. Early meetings are reserved for conversations that matter. I walked in with my black notebook and a printed executive summary. 6 pages. Concise, structured, no dramatic language. He skimmed the first page, then stopped. "You built this yourself?" he asked. "Yes." "How long have you been modeling this?" "About 18 months, I said evenly, in parallel with project coordination. That wasn't entirely precise. The thinking had been happening for 3 years. But the formal modeling? 18 months sounded intentional, not reactive. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about Vanessa. Not about past meetings. About scalability thresholds. About cultural risk and expansion. About how operational blind spots quietly derail growth, even when the strategy is sound. At one point, he leaned back and said something simple. "Why aren't you in strategic planning?" I didn't answer defensively. "I've been focused on execution," I said. "But I believe the next growth phase requires tighter integration between strategy and operations." Translation: I'm ready. When I left that office, I knew I was standing at a decision point. Option 1. Continue quietly contributing. Allow recognition to grow gradually. And trust that time will rebalance perception. Option 2. Address Vanessa directly, clarify boundaries, and possibly fracture whatever remained of our working relationship. Option 3. Pursue structural repositioning. Request formal inclusion in the expansion strategy, knowing it would permanently shift power dynamics. The third option was irreversible. Once you step into the same arena as someone who has been curating your influence, proximity changes. Informal lunches change. Observation becomes mutual. I sat at my desk that afternoon, watching Vanessa laugh at something on her screen. She looked relaxed, confident, likely anticipating her promotion announcement. For a moment, I considered protecting the comfort of what we had. It's strange how loyalty lingers even after clarity. But loyalty without reciprocity is self-erasure. The irreversible choice wasn't about ambition. It was about ownership. So I drafted a formal proposal. Not emotional, not accusatory. A request to transition into a hybrid strategy operations lead role for the expansion initiative, positioning myself as the integration point between visionary planning and execution infrastructure. I attached a refined version of my viability model, and I copied HR, not dramatically, procedurally. That was the decision, not to expose her, not to undermine her, but to remove the space where my thinking could be filtered through someone else's voice. Because once authority becomes official, informal reporting loses value. I didn't tell her. I didn't hint. I didn't change my tone in our next lunch conversation. She asked casually, "Anything new on expansion chatter?" I took a sip of water. "Just ongoing analysis," I said, which was true. The decision point isn't loud. It's a quiet moment where you choose the version of yourself you're willing to defend. And I had chosen mine. Once the proposal was submitted, I did the most important thing. Nothing visible. No change in demeanor, no sudden confidence display, no withdrawal. The instinct when you make a bold move is to telegraph it, to brace for reaction. But reaction invites counter-strategy. Silence preserves momentum. HR responded first. A neutral acknowledgement. Proposal received. Under review with senior leadership. Vanessa remained unaware, at least outwardly. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued operating exactly as before, coordinating timelines, sending summaries, and attending meetings with composed precision. But beneath that routine, structural shifts were beginning. The senior partner requested a follow-up session, this time including finance. My expansion model had triggered deeper cost modeling discussions. I was invited directly, not as support. As a contributor, the invitation list told its own story. Vanessa wasn't on it. That wasn't personal. It was functional. Expansion viability had moved from visionary framing to financial validation, and finance prefers numbers to narratives. In that meeting, I didn't overperform. I didn't assert dominance. I answered questions clearly, referenced data calmly, and acknowledged uncertainties without dramatizing them. Strategic credibility isn't built through intensity. It's built through steadiness under scrutiny. Afterward, the senior partner said something brief in the hallway. "We'll need you more involved in this." Need. That word shifts weight. Meanwhile, I adjusted small behaviors internally. I formalized my documentation habits. I archived email threads where my recommendations aligned with subsequent decisions. I organized project histories chronologically. not to weaponize, but to reference if necessary. Preparation without paranoia. At lunch, Vanessa continued probing. I heard finance is digging deeper into expansion. Any idea why? She asked one afternoon, tone light but eyes sharp. Standard diligence, I replied. She studied me again, longer this time. There's a subtle discomfort people feel when informational asymmetry reverses. She was used to knowing slightly more than others. Now she wasn't sure. But she didn't confront, because there was nothing to confront. I hadn't accused her. I hadn't withdrawn friendship. I hadn't exposed anything. I'd simply stopped being predictable. A week later, leadership announced a temporary expansion strategy task force, cross-functional, limited seats. My name was included. So was Vanessa's. But the role descriptions were different. She was listed as Strategic Communications Lead. I was listed as Strategy Operations Integration. Titles matter. They define territory. In our first task force meeting, she presented a high-level expansion vision deck. Confident, polished, well-received. Then the senior partner turned to me. Chloe, can you walk us through infrastructure feasibility? There it was, not as a rebuttal, as a sequence. Vision followed by validation. And for the first time in 3 years, my voice wasn't being translated. It was primary. I spoke calmly, data-backed, forward-looking. No emotional charge. No reference to history. Just clarity. Moving in silence doesn't mean invisibility. It means timing your visibility. And by the time Vanessa realized the structure had shifted, the structure was already official. The consequences didn't arrive with conflict. They arrived in confusion. In the weeks following the task force formation, small imbalances began surfacing. Not dramatic enough to name, but noticeable if you were paying attention. Vanessa was still articulate, still polished, still respected, but something had shifted in how rooms responded to her. When she outlined expansion opportunities, leadership listened. When she finished, they turned to me. Does the infrastructure support that timeline? What are the staffing implications? Have we stress tested that scenario? The questions weren't attacks. They were calibrations. For years, her framing had moved upward without friction because the operational counterweight arrived filtered through her. Now, the counterweight sat at the same table, directly. In one meeting, she proposed accelerating market entry by a quarter to capitalize on competitor instability. It was bold, well-articulated, strategically sound on the surface. The senior partner nodded thoughtfully, then looked at me. Chloe? I didn't contradict her. I simply laid out resource strain projections, vendor onboarding lag, and cultural assimilation risk. If leadership scaled faster than team absorption rates, no emotion, no resistance, just math. The room didn't dismiss her, but the timeline adjusted. Afterward, in the hallway, she walked beside me quietly. You've really stepped into expansion lately, she said, tone measured. Yes, I replied, it's an interesting phase for the firm. A pause. I didn't realize you were modeling this in depth, she added. I've been tracking patterns for a while. Truth without accusation. That was the first time I saw it. A flicker of recalculation in her expression. Not anger, not betrayal. Assessment. Consequences in professional environments rarely look like punishment. They look like redistribution. Over the next month, more direct requests came to me. Finance copied me on risk reviews. Operations asked for my forecast input before aligning with the strategy. HR requested insight into hiring ramp models. Vanessa wasn't excluded, but she was no longer the sole bridge between vision and feasibility. And that changed her influence bandwidth. Lunches became less probing, more surface level. She still asked questions, but cautiously, as if testing whether access had permanently narrowed. I remained cordial, open, but precise. One afternoon, she said lightly, "You've been sending a lot more follow-up summaries lately." Yes, I smiled. Clarity helps everyone. Clarity. It's difficult to manipulate language that's documented. By the end of the quarter, leadership announced that the expansion strategy would operate under a dual lead model, vision and integration. Her domain and mine. The consequences weren't explosive. They were structural. She still held influence. She still presented confidently. But her leverage no longer flowed through my private analysis. And that meant her edge had softened, not because I diminished her, but because I stopped amplifying her. In offices, power isn't just about who speaks. It's about whose information depends on. And for the first time in 3 years, my value wasn't being backgrounded. It was being named, quietly, officially, and permanently. By the time she realized the shift wasn't temporary, it was already embedded. The dual lead model formalized everything, vision and integration, Two parallel lanes, equal weight, different authority. At first, Vanessa adapted quickly. She leaned into communication polish, narrative framing, and stakeholder alignment. It suited her strengths. But expansion planning isn't sustained by narrative alone. It requires tension testing, scenario modeling, quiet recalibration when numbers resist optimism. And those recalibrations are now routed through me. I began noticing something subtle in meetings, a slight tightening in her posture when follow-up questions came my way. Not defensive, just aware. In one session, after I presented a phased hiring structure that extended rollout by 6 weeks to preserve retention rates, leadership agreed almost immediately. The senior partner turned to Vanessa. We'll need the comms plan to reflect Chloe's integration timeline. Reflect Chloe's timeline. Language matters. After the meeting, she asked if we could talk. We stepped into a smaller conference room, glass walls, soft light, no raised voices. I feel like things have shifted, she said carefully. We used to align more informally. There it was. Alignment. Informal. I think we're aligning structurally now, I replied evenly. Which is better for expansion? She held my gaze for a second longer than usual. I always valued our conversations, she said. Your perspective helped shape a lot of my thinking. Past tense. Helped. I'm glad, I said. Silence filled the room. There was an opportunity there to name the history, to say you reported my every move, to confront the pattern openly. But confrontation would have reframed this as interpersonal. It wasn't. It was structural evolution. I just don't want misalignment between us, she added. Neither do I said calmly. That's why clarity matters. And in that moment, she understood something without me stating it. The access had closed, not emotionally, professionally. The private funnel was gone. Information no longer flowed through lunches. It flowed through documents, shared dashboards, and official planning channels. And once processes formalize, informal influence shrinks. Over the next few weeks, I saw her attempt small recalibrations, inviting me to co-present earlier in the decks, asking for my input in writing before meetings, looping me into conversations proactively. They weren't manipulative. They were adaptive, but they were late because the power dynamic had already equalized, not through exposure, but through authority. Too late to fix it doesn't mean irreversible damage. It means irreversible clarity. We weren't friends who happened to work together. We were professionals whose incentives had diverged. And once incentives diverge in competitive environments, nostalgia doesn't repair alignment. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, because what had changed wasn't her behavior. It was my boundaries. And boundaries, once enforced quietly and consistently, don't need explanation. By the time she stopped asking probing questions at lunch, she already knew why. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't explosive. It was administrative. HR scheduled a calibration session for the expansion task force leads, a standard alignment review before finalizing permanent roles. It was framed as procedural, routine. Vanessa and I were seated across from each other in a quiet conference room. The senior partner sat at the head of the table, HR to his right. There was no tension in the air, just evaluation. They reviewed our respective contributions, her stakeholder engagement metrics, my integration modeling accuracy, delivery milestones, budget preservation outcomes. Then HR asked a neutral question. How has collaboration between vision and integration evolved? Vanessa spoke first. It's been a learning curve, she said smoothly. Chloe's perspective has always been strong operationally. We're refining how to balance speed with structure. Operationally. It wasn't an insult, but it was familiar. A narrowing. The senior partner turned to me. I didn't counter her. I didn't defend my scope emotionally. I believe expansion requires synchronized strategy and infrastructure, I said calmly. Over the past quarter, we've reduced projected margin volatility by 12% by aligning rollout pace with capacity modeling. That balance is working. No edge, just numbers. HR nodded, typing. Then the senior partner asked something slightly sharper. Have there been any challenges in communication? A quieter room might have interpreted that as an invitation. Vanessa glanced at me, briefly. I chose precision over history. In earlier phases, I said evenly, informal conversations sometimes created ambiguity around attribution and positioning. Since formalizing documentation and shared dashboards, alignment has improved. It was the closest I would come to naming it. No accusations. No past tense blame. Just structure. Vanessa didn't interrupt. She didn't deny. She nodded once. That's fair, she said. Formal processes have helped. And that was it. No exposure. No humiliation. just an acknowledgement that informal influence had been replaced by documented authority. After the meeting, as we walked down the hallway together, she spoke quietly. "You could have said more in there?" "Yes," I replied. "Why didn't you?" "Because humiliation weakens credibility. Because anger muddies evidence. Because dominance doesn't require spectacle." But I didn't say any of that. "It wasn't necessary," I said simply. She studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. That was the final recalibration, not a friendship ending, not an apology exchanged, just mutual recognition. The colleague who shared lunch with me had reported my every move, and I had responded not with confrontation but with elevation. Confrontation without heat isn't avoidance, it's control. When you remove emotion from truth, what remains is structure. And structure, once visible, doesn't need defending. It's been a year since the expansion officially launched. The satellite office is stable, not explosive, not chaotic, stable. Margin volatility stayed within projected thresholds. Retention rates exceeded industry averages. Rollout pacing became a case study inside the firm. My title now reads Director of Strategy and Integration. It's longer than my old one, heavier. But the real shift isn't in the title. It's in how I occupy rooms. I don't wait to be invited into strategic conversations anymore. I enter them prepared. I speak early enough to shape direction, not late enough to correct damage. And interestingly, I speak less than most, because I no longer need volume to secure a position. Vanessa remains at the firm. We work together professionally, respectfully, efficiently. Our lunches stop naturally. No dramatic fallout, just diverging schedules, diverging priorities. Occasionally, we still share a conference table. She presents vision. I validate feasibility. The dynamic is balanced now, transparent. There's no hostility between us, just awareness. The most surprising part of this entire journey isn't that she reported my every move. It's what I needed it to happen. Not for pain, for precision. If she hadn't reframed my language, I might never have recognized how casually I was outsourcing my narrative. If leadership hadn't mischaracterized me as cautious and operational, I might never have formalized my strategic thinking. Being underestimated sharpened me, but being backgrounded matured me. There's a difference. I no longer see myself as the quiet support. I see myself as the architect who prefers foundations over applause. My black notebook still sits on my desk, but now it contains projections, directional frameworks, structural hypotheses, not just observations about other people's behavior. I've learned something simple, but transformative. Friendship in professional spaces must survive transparency. If someone benefits from your private insight without publicly protecting your authorship, that isn't friendship. It's proximity with incentive. And proximity always expires when power shifts. I don't carry bitterness, because bitterness ties you to past versions of yourself. What I carry now is discernment. I still listen carefully. I still analyze patterns. I still speak calmly. But access to my unfiltered thinking is earned, not assumed. Who I am now isn't louder. It's clearer. Clear about value, clear about boundaries, clear about timing. The quiet woman in the corner was never weak. She was studying architecture, and now she builds it. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a final twist, a dramatic resignation, a public apology, a career-ending reveal. There wasn't one. The colleague who shared lunch with me was reporting my every move. And the most powerful response wasn't exposure, it was evolution. For 3 years, I confused proximity with trust. I believed that being included in conversations meant being protected within them. I thought that if I stayed kind, steady, and competent, recognition would naturally follow. But organizations don't reward intention. They reward visibility aligned with value. And value must be positioned, not just possessed. The lesson wasn't don't trust anyone. It wasn't never share your thoughts. And it definitely wasn't seek revenge. The lesson was this: guard your narrative. If someone consistently reframes your voice in rooms you're not in, the solution isn't to fight them in whispers. It's to step into the room yourself. Documentation over emotion, structure over confrontation, elevation over retaliation. Quiet dominance isn't about silencing others. It's about refusing to let your thinking be filtered without consent. 3 years of friendship, one hidden agenda. But hidden agendas only work when you don't see the architecture. Once you see it, you don't need to destroy it. You redesign around it. So here's what I'll leave you with. Have you ever realized someone was benefiting from your insight while quietly reshaping your image? And if you did you confront them? Or did you reposition yourself? I'm reading the comments.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.